The story really starts with what Anne is going to be telling you about in our observations in our own yard. But I'm going to skip ahead and talk about the third book in our Dirt trilogy, Growing a Revolution, because that's the book where I tried to answer the question of could we actually rebuild healthy, fertile soils at scale on fully operational, profitable farms. Because for any style of farming to be sustainable, first of all, it has to be profitable and sustainable for the farmers, or it won't be sustained. And what I did is I took 6 months off from my job at the University of Washington, and I traveled around the world visiting farmers who had already restored health and fertility to their land. I did that thing that is kind of, I guess, unusual for many academics. I went and I listened to people. And I asked the farmers that I visited, what did you do? Give me a shovel. Let's dig holes in your field. Let's dig holes in your neighbor's field. Show me your soil and tell me your processes, how you got there. And I went to Equatorial Africa. I went to Central America. I went across North America. And then I finally ran out of a travel budget and I had to stop and write the book up. And what I found is that the common denominator between the farmers that I visited around the world who had already demonstrated that they could take degraded, worn-out land and turn it into really fertile and profitably farmed land, who had done the opposite of what I showed you at that North Carolina tobacco plantation. People who had fixed their soil and done it at a pace a geologist considers remarkably fast. The three principles they all had in common were the ones up on the screen now. They didn't disturb their soil much, which meant they were doing things like no-till agriculture. They were not plowing anymore. They also maintained a permanent ground cover. So they were planting cover crops. They were keeping the ground covered with a living plant at all times. They were not doing what I showed you the farmers in the Palouse were doing. These people would plant cover crops in between their cash crops, or even in and amongst their cash crops, depending on where in the world they were and their style of farming. And they also planted diverse crop rotations. They were not just growing one or two crops. And all those little microbes up on the screen around there are there to remind me to basically say that if you were to imagine a system to try and cultivate the beneficial organisms in the soil, this is how you would do it. You wouldn't disturb them. Imagine if somebody took the roof off of your house once a year and stirred all your belongings up. You'd move pretty fast, right? My guess is like once would be enough and we'd be out of there. Well, Mike, doing a plow does that to microbial life in the soil. Imagine being a worm in the soil and a plow coming through. It's a disaster. Maintaining a permanent ground cover. These cover crops, that's a way to introduce carbon into the soil. It's a way to feed the soil with organic matter because you're not exporting it. You basically kill the cover crops off, they rot, and what you've done with the cover crops is taken mineral elements out of the soil, get them into the plant. You then kill that plant off. As that plant rots, the microbes in the soil make that material available to the plant. You're fertilizing your next cash crop with your cover crops. And diverse crop rotations, the diversity is a way to get in a multiplicity of functions. Imagine how dysfunctional a village would be if all you had was auto mechanics or geologists. It wouldn't be a terribly diverse community and productive. Those general principles translated to all the settings I visited around the world. That minimal disturbance, the cover crops, and the diverse rotations. But the specific practices that farmers used in different parts of the world were totally different. They had to figure out how to adapt those broad principles to their setting, to their technological level, to their technologies, to their economies, sometimes even to their political and social systems, but to their soil and to their crops. Soils are one of the most diverse natural resources we have. There's something like 300,000 different named types of soils in the world, and it might be 200,000. The point is, it's a huge number of different kinds of soils. Even on one farm, you'll have different areas that could behave differently. The farmers I visited who had applied these principles and figured it out had done so through a lot of trial and error and tinkering and figuring out how to make a new system of thinking work. Because if you look at those three principles, the minimal disturbance, the cover crops, and the diversity of crops, they are the 180-degree opposite of what we've been teaching in agronomy for the last 100 years, in teaching tillage-intensive, chemical-intensive monocultures. This is a new way of thinking about the soil. It's not necessarily so much about organic versus conventional practices as it is about thinking differently about how to deal with the soil and tailoring practices to cultivating the life that benefits one's crops. The kind of people I visited were people like these, Dwayne Beck at Dakota Lakes Research Farm. I'm going to spare you all the details I go into in Growing Our Evolution on these guys, but Dwayne was working with farmers up to 20,000 acres, 20,000 acres, big farms in the Dakotas. Think, horizon to horizon type farms, large-scale commercial industrialized farms. They were figuring out how to apply these principles of dealing with no-till cover crops and diversity in the crops. And what they'd done is they'd managed to slash their diesel, fertilizer, and pesticide use by more than half. Those are the three big expenses in modern conventional farming. So they were growing just as much, spending less to do it, they were profitable. That's what helped it catch on. When I left his farm, I asked him whether the ideas that he was using would actually work for subsistence farmers in Africa. And he said, don't ask me, I'm not a subsistence farmer in Africa. Go ask this gentleman here, Kofi Boa. He runs the No-Till Center for Research in Kumasi, Ghana, and he's done an amazing thing teaching people in and around his village to go to no-till with a diversity of crops. They're managing small farms. This room would be a reasonably sized farm for around his village. But what he did is he taught people by thinking about the soil differently. They were able to double and triple their crop yields without using fertilizers, without using pesticides, without using patented seeds. They did it by changing the way they think about the soil, and it transformed the economy of their region. Gabe Brown and David Brant, the two gentlemen pictured here, are two North American farmers that I visited. Gabe basically taught me that the value of bringing livestock into farming operations in terms of their ability to manure the soil and actually rebuild fertility. A lot of the problems with livestock management isn't so much the cows, it's how we manage the cows. You put all the cows in a confined feeding operation, you turn their manure into a waste product. You let them manure the fields like Gabe has done, and he's actually been restoring native prairie using cows as his primary tool. It's about how you manage the cows. David Brant there is holding up one of his tillage radishes. He sells corn, soybeans, and wheat into the North American commodity markets. He's a conventional farmer, but he has some unconventional ideas. He views himself as a bit of a microbe rancher. He grows diverse cover crops to feed the microbes in his soil. And you'll notice the field behind him is sort of yellowish. That's his neighbor's soybean field. All the green stuff that you can see on that screen, those are glyphosate-resistant weeds. They've been sprayed 3 times that year. You cannot kill them. They depress the yield that those farmers get. They have an economic impact. Notice David's field is nice and green. It's got a lot of cover crops in it. David doesn't have weeds in his fields. He plants them. He calls them cover crops. He turns nature to working for him instead of trying to fight nature. And it works out very well for him. In fact, it works out to the degree, and the reason that it works out very well, in fact, he sort of bought his neighbor's farm recently since I visited. How is he so much more profitable than his neighbors? Because he's spending very little on inputs, and he's harvesting more than they are. He's making more, he's more profitable. And this is why. This is his soil. This is the soil he had in 2014 when I visited. This is the soil he had back in 1971. This is actually from his neighbor's farm, but it is very much like what he had in 1971. Less than 2% organic matter. This one has, 3 times that or so. He rebuilt the fertility of his land, and he's harvesting the benefit. This land degradation problem can be reversed. This is a photo from Gabe Brown's farm showing the animals that he brings back in after to graze off his cover crops. So he'll plant a cash crop, then plant a cover crop, then he brings the livestock in to graze the cover crop. And what the livestock are doing is they're basically functioning as 4-legged, mobile, self-propelled methane digesters that consume the crop stubble, excrete it as manure, and that manure is rich in all the nutrients it takes to grow new plants. He's using the livestock to accelerate the cycling of nutrients in the soil, and that allows him not only to grow his crops, but also to sell eggs and to sell meat. What's that done to his soil? This is Gabe's hand with the soil on that very piece of ground I was just showing you. It's rich, black earth. This is his neighbor's organic farm. Which looks more fertile? Which has healthier soil? Now, I started teasing Gabe and David Brant and calling them organic-ish farmers because they had so reduced their need or reliance on chemical inputs. And I think Gabe is actually now completely off of them, if I recall correctly. And we have a huge opportunity in conventional agriculture to try and transform conventional practices into these organic-ish practices. And we also have an opportunity in organic agriculture to try and get at, well, why does the organic field have less carbon in it? Because they plow so much. There's other ways to think about managing weeds than the plow. And it's a challenge to figure out how to do it in an organic system. But challenges are what human ingenuity was designed to go up against and figure ways around. And these guys that I've just been sharing with you are people that were inspirational to both Ann and I in terms of thinking about how to think about the problem of reversing the historical problem of soil degradation that's plagued societies around the world. And it led Ann and I to think about the diet of plants. And I'll admit, as a geologist, I was never trained to think about plants having a diet. It was kind of an odd idea for me, but I think it's actually pretty apt now. And we discuss in the Hidden Half of Nature the difference between a fertilizer diet and what we call a soil health diet. Because on a fertilizer diet, you can grow big crops that have high yields in really poor degraded soil if you add enough of the major elements that the plants need for growth. This is the story of agriculture in the second half of the 20th century, after all. But what about the health of the plants? If you actually look at what happens to a plant that you feed a lot of the major elements it needs for growth, it turns into what Ann and I call couch potato crops. They stop investing so much in their root system. This has consequences that Ann is going to elaborate on in a few minutes. But those plants will get less in the way of mineral micronutrients, less in the way of beneficial microbial metabolites that bolster plant health. In contrast, plants grown in healthy, fertile soil, organic matter-rich soil, full of life, they don't need as much external supplement in terms of the major elements, and they get more mineral micronutrients, which means more mineral micronutrients in our food, and they also get more beneficial metabolites, and the plants are stimulated to make more secondary plant metabolites, which turn out to be something called phytochemicals, which are good for us. So I summarized in Growing a Revolution the recipe for healthy, fertile soil. Ann and I sort of conspired to think up, sort of a nice short tagline for the book. What we came up with was ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity. That's the recipe for taking intensive agriculture and moving it from a style that degrades the land into a style that can improve the land. And you can argue, and I think quite compellingly, that if you want to accelerate this, you could think about reintegrating livestock, animal husbandry, and cropping. There was a paper that we found in Research in Growing a Revolution that went through the math on if we took all the livestock and the CAFOs around the country and we redistributed them on farms, they would produce enough manure that you could actually replace 90% of the nitrogen fertilizer that we use on corn and not move any cow outside of the county it already resides in. That would be pretty amazing. We split animal husbandry and cropping back in the mid-20th century. Some of the people I've been visiting have been experimenting with reintegrating them. The kind of benefits that could result from rebuilding healthy, fertile soils, well, it's more profitable for the farmers. That's incredibly important for making it work and stick. It can result in comparable crop yields. That's important for feeding the world. But it also allows us to do that with less fossil fuel, less fertilizer, and less pesticides. Whether or not one goes organic or organic-ish, this is a benefit. It also allows us to put carbon in the soil. All the differences between those khaki and those dark soils, that's carbon. It also results in better water retention, less pollution on the landscape. And I'm arguing that we're poised for what I hope will be a fifth agricultural revolution, one rooted in the concepts of soil health. We've gone through a series of 4 agricultural revolutions, and I think we're poised for a fifth one. If you're curious about the other 4, well, I talk about that in Growing a Revolution. I'm more interested in the future that I think we can use to reshape agriculture.